Last year I did a video talking about 5 great picks for your first ever pet reptile, including crested geckos and corn snakes, so make sure you go back and check that out. But I got a little bit of flack for it because I didn't have bearded dragons or ball pythons on the list, and especially bearded dragons are often considered an amazing first pet reptile, and I had a few opposing views to that, so I didn't include them. But today we're back with 5 more great first picks for your first ever pet reptile, and bearded dragons and ball pythons finally made the list. Psych! Just kidding. No, they didn't. So yes, even with 5 more great choices for a first reptile, bearded dragons and ball pythons still don't make the list. They don't make my top 10. Technically, this would make it. And if you want to hear my reasoning for that, you can go back and watch part 1. I talk about why I don't have them. But today, let's talk about 5 new reptiles that don't have bearded dragons and ball pythons that are great for novice reptile keepers. I personally recommend blue-tongued skinks over bearded dragons, and I know not having bearded dragons on either of my beginner reptiles list is like heresy in the reptile keeping community because you can't bad talk the bearded dragons, but I personally think these guys make much better pets. Like bearded dragons, blue-tongued skinks get fairly large compared to geckos, so as such you can't keep them in a 10-gallon tank. They do need bigger enclosure sizes. I would say minimum 3 by 2 foot, maybe 4 by 2 foot would be even better. Really the size of this table, though that's a pretty bad example because you guys can't see the full table, but they need bigger space. And also they're also both omnivores. They have somewhat similar diets. They need bugs, but they also need salad, fruits, and veggies. So Lou here, I feed him twice a week. He gets a bug day and then he gets a salad day. Now, bearded dragons are kind of infamously notorious for being very difficult to get to eat their salad as they get bigger for a lot of them. I ran into that with some of my bearded dragons. Whereas Lou here, he's basically like a bottomless pit. He'll really eat anything I put in front of him. And another thing that makes this easier that I do with my blue tongue, and I know many other people do with their blue tongue, is that I feed him wet cat food. So on salad day, I mix together his greens, his fruits, and his veggies. But then I also mix in some wet cat food and I mix it around so everything tastes like cat food, which yummy, he loves the taste of cat food, and then he eats the entire thing. While bearded dragons like it dry and hot, these guys, they like it a little bit cooler and a little bit more humid. They like a humidity somewhere like 50 to 60%, and temperatures are going to be a few degrees cooler than for the bearded dragons. And the main selling point that I usually push these guys over bearded dragons with is that they just do more. Bearded dragons, don't get me wrong, they're a great pet to like hang out on the couch and just chill and watch TV with, but even in their enclosure, they just don't move much. They're not very engaging to watch. They're not very interactive. And I mean, for most people, that's fine. I mean, we're reptile keepers. We know this is not going to be like having a pet bird or a pet dog they don't really want to be played with. But especially for first-time reptile keepers, they like having something that they can at least watch move, which bearded dragons don't move a whole lot. But these guys, they're like always on the move. You can take them outside, they're having fun exploring in the grass. When you go to feed them, they're waiting at the door like a little hungry puppy. They can't wait to be fed. They're so rambunctious. They have so much personality for such a weird-looking little sausage lizard that they're so fun as reptile pets. Another difference with blue-tongued skinks, and this is more of a kind of contentious topic as far as reptile keepers and breeders go, is they don't necessarily need a UV light. Now, if you go online, YouTube, there's plenty of breeders that have blue tongues with UV light that are thriving, living their full lives, breeding, eating, etc. But then you can also find a bunch of keepers and breeders that don't give their blue tongues UV light, and they're still living their full lives, eating, healthy, breeding. So both ways can work. Again, this is kind of a gray area. I'm not going to tell you one way or the other. Whereas with bearded dragons, there's no way around it. They need that UV light. They always need the UV bulb. And with bearded dragons, I get in probably 8 to 10 beardies at least a year from parents whose kids lost interest, they got bored of them, they're doing sports, they don't have time for them, etc. I get a lot of bearded dragons in through my door. Blue tongues, though, I get 0. And one of the main differences is the price. Whereas a beardie you can get for like 50 bucks. Blue tongues cost usually at least probably $200. So it's a more serious kind of monetary investment just getting the lizard. And normally that makes people a bit more serious about the investment. They're not willing to just get the lizard and be like, I don't really want this anymore. Because normally if you get a blue tongue skink for $200 to $300, you are very serious about giving that a home. You're not usually looking to rehome it within a year because you got bored. Plus, I mean, how can you get bored of this? They're a chubby sausage lizard, so they're low on the list because of the price and some of these care things like we talked about, but they are still an amazing pet reptile. I actually already have a care guide for the Western Hognose snake if you're seriously considering getting one, but they are an amazing pet snake. They have so much personality packed into this little body, and they are infamously adorable as far as pet snakes go. Now, the one main caveat with this snake as a pet, and I talk about it more in length in that care video, is that this is a rear fang venomous snake. This snake does have venom. Saying that though, there's a few things to talk about with this venom. First off is that it's very weak. Here in New York State, all venomous snakes are illegal to own as a pet. All venomous snakes, rattlesnakes, copperheads, cobras, etc. And even the big rear fang snakes like mangrove snakes and things like that. However, any reptile expo you go to, you will find hundreds of hognose snakes for sale because New York has them legal because they realize they are not a significantly dangerous venomous snake. And this is just a really small snake. I mean, right here, this is an adult male with Bernie right here, and females, they don't get a whole lot bigger. They max out at like 3 or so feet long. And with this, they are venomous, but I mean, their venom delivery system isn't like that of a cobra or a viper where they have big fangs at the front of their mouth that are hollow and can inject a lot of venom really quickly. They have basically an enlarged tooth at the back of their mouth with a groove on it, and that drips venom. So when they bite something, they have to really work their mouth on it to get that back tooth in, and then it just kind of slowly drips venom down, which again is very good against small toads and frogs, not so good against giant people. So yes, they are technically venomous, but with their very weak venom, their very poor venom delivery system, and their overall just really docile nature, I still feel perfectly responsible recommending them as a first pet reptile. The two other kind of minor detractors from hognose, which is why they're lower on this list besides the weak venom, is that they burrow a lot. Sometimes it'll feel like you're just taking care of an empty tank and you won't see them very much. Also, with them being amphibian eaters primarily in the wild, it means sometimes they can have a little difficulty going after rodents as feeders, because most of us, we can't just buy in bulk like feeder toads and stuff to feed our hognose snake. But with these being so popularly captive bred, and again, make sure you get a captive bred one, not a wild caught one, but with them being so popular at expos by breeders, usually the breeders are going to be doing the hard work for you. They're going to get the hognose snake born, they're going to convert it over to pinkies and such. So when you get one, when you're talking to a breeder at an expo, just double check, make sure they are on rodents, frozen, thawed, live, whatever. I mean, that's your preference, but make sure they are on rodents, they're not regurgitating, they're not having problems or difficulty, make sure they are eating and growing. So with the breeder doing most of the heavy lifting for this, again, as long as you get like a good reputable breeder with hognoses, then it's not a huge detractor from having a hognose snake. And even if they don't eat right away, not a big deal. Bernie here goes without food 3 to 4 months every winter like clockwork, because they are a North American snake, so they are used to kind of broodmating through the winter. So it's really not a big deal. And even if your hognose does have issues eating, there's plenty of videos on YouTube like Snake Discovery and other hognose people that have videos all about tricks you can do to get your hognose to eat. So even with the minor difficulties, it's still an amazing pet snake. Just with their personalities, their very mild heat and humidity requirements, their size, their just general docile nature, this is still a pet I can very strongly recommend. If you are looking for your first ever pet snake, hognoses are definitely one you should consider. Milk snakes are probably the second most popular pet colubrid after corn snakes, and you get a ton of variety. They come in a whole bunch of different subspecies, coloration, and more so than king snakes and corn snakes, I would argue for sure. And they are just an amazing first pet snake. King snakes, corn snakes, and milk snakes kind of make like the triforce of common pet colubrids, with corn snakes obviously being at the top because they are amazing. They are in part 1 of this video. They are like almost perfect pet snakes. There's really like no cons to owning a corn snake, at least that just go along with general snake care. King snakes and milk snakes, they each kind of have their own slight detractors from them that don't make them as good as corn snakes, I would say. King snakes, as I could personally attest, are very food motivated. They can be very nippy. With my California king, that door opens, anything that goes in is food, so that is one thing you have to look out for. Milk snakes, on the other hand, they're not really nippy, but they're usually a bit harder to like get used to holding, I would say. They tend to be more squiggly and squirmy in my experience. Now this is Vincent. He's my brand new Pueblan milk snake, and he isn't too bad right now, but when I first got him a little while ago, he was really not wanting to be handled. They tend to be very squirmy, very squiggly. They're fine to just squiggle and slither right out of your hands and hit the floor. So I would say corn snakes are a bit better in that regards, which is why they were in the first video and these guys are in the second. Saying that they're really not aggressive at all. They aren't really bitey or anything like king snakes can be. They don't get huge. They get about the same size for the most part as corn snakes, somewhere in the 3 to 5 foot range. This is an adult Pueblan right here. at least a male. And with these guys, very similar kind of care requirements to a corn snake. They don't have extreme heat requirements. You can keep them on newspaper or paper towel. You can keep them on aspen bedding. They don't need anything super elaborate or humid holding or anything like that. Keep them in like a 40-gallon tank or a 3-foot by 2-foot enclosure for the biggest ones. These guys are just amazing pet snakes. They also, you never have to worry about rats with these guys, which is always nice for a pet snake. Adult mice are fine for them, and you feed them every other week. This is honestly just a very, very solid first pet snake, which is why I'm talking about him in this video. Again, not as strong as the corn snake, I would say, but still, you definitely get a lot more color with them. Spotted pythons are an amazing pet snake and are very criminally underrated as pet reptiles, especially compared to like North American snakes like our colubrids. These guys are usually just really overlooked. And as someone that has a lot of Australian reptiles and loves Australian reptiles, these guys are just perfect, especially compared to like carpet pythons, green tree pythons, water pythons, which all have a very valid reputation of being nippy. Spotted pythons are just absolute sweethearts. And I should also mention that this spot is kind of tied hand in hand with Stimson's pythons and children's pythons, which are also pythons from the genus Antaresia, which have some of the world's smallest python species. And these guys, they all get about the same size, similar coloration, very similar body shape and temperament. So it's really, I'm talking about all three of them, but I'm just gonna focus on the spotted because that's the one I have. And when I say small, I mean small. Children's pythons and spotted pythons max out at like 4 feet in length. So what you see with Ophelia here, if she ever decides to unravel, which she doesn't, but this is basically what you're signing up for as an adult with a spotted python. It is very manageable. There are corn snakes and king snakes that get longer than this. I did want to specifically highlight the spotted python though, because at least in my experience, these seem to be the most easily to find online and at expos compared to the other ones. This snake does not need a very big setup. I mean, they are very active, so the more space you give them, they will use it. You can give a bunch of stuff to climb on and everything. It's very different than caring for like a hognose or a sand boa, which are gonna spend a lot of time burrowing or hiding. They also don't need to ever worry about rats with this snake. You just give them a large mouse like I do every other week for their feeding and they're fine. They don't need it really hot. They don't need it really humid. I keep mine on aspen bedding with a warm end temp, probably in like the high 80s. So it's really very manageable. They're gonna be a bit harder to find. They're not as common at pet stores as ball pythons and corn snakes, and they're a bit more expensive. They're usually at $80 to $100 for one, but still, this is a fantastic pet snake. And even though it is a little bit more of a price tag, it's not a whole lot. And this is a snake whose care even the most novice reptile keeper can wrap their head around. For part one last year, the leopard gecko and the crested gecko came out as the top 2 best reptiles I could possibly recommend to someone brand new to reptile keeping. And for today, we're gonna kind of continue that tradition with a somewhat close cousin of the leopard gecko, the African fat-tailed gecko. Fat-tailed geckos stay a bit smaller than leopard geckos, and they have a shorter, stouter tail and different coloration. I don't have a fat-tailed gecko, so you're just gonna have to look at Dustin here and use your imagination. They're somewhat similar in care to leopard geckos, but not exactly. They stay small, they don't get huge, so a 10, 15, 20-gallon tank is fine for their whole life. They're full insectivores, so you're always looking at some type of bug, roaches, cockroaches, etc. They also can drop their tail if they get scared, just like a leopard gecko, but they'll grow it back. They're nocturnal, so they don't need a UV light. And with time and some patience, they can make amazingly handleable pet lizards, just like leopards and crested geckos. The main differences between leopard geckos and fat-tailed geckos, at least that I can tell, because again, I'm just a warning, I'm not a fat-tailed gecko expert. I don't have one. I just have the leopard gecko here, but from what I can tell, they like it a bit cooler and a bit more humid than leopard geckos. You're going to want the temperatures a few degrees cooler, and for both of these lizards, you want to give them a humid hide. It's basically a closed-off hide with paper towel or sphagnum moss, something in there you can mist that'll keep humidity so it'll help when it's time for them to shed. For a fat-tailed gecko, you're going to want to mist this a bit more often than you would for leopard gecko. Leopard geckos like humidity like 30 to 40%, whereas fat-tailed geckos you want it like 50, 60, 65%. This is still, I think, very easily manageable for any novice reptile keeper. It's kind of almost like taking a few elements from crested gecko care and combining it with leopard gecko care. But I will say the reason why this lizard's on this list and wasn't on part 1 compared to leopard and crested geckos is that they're a bit pricier and they're harder to find. Leopard geckos and crested geckos you can find at every pet store. They're at a bunch of tables at every expo. You can even find them on Craigslist and stuff. Fat-tail geckos are a bit harder to find. They're more expensive. You're looking at like probably more around $100 or more, depending on the coloration and stuff like that, than leopard geckos. So they're a bit more serious of a monetary investment than buying a leopard gecko, but I still think they are an amazing pet reptile, which is why they're #1 on this list. So those were 5 more amazing first reptile choices if you're looking for your first ever pet snake or lizard. Like the video if you learned something. Thank you to our amazing patrons for supporting the channel. It means a lot to me. If you'd like to do that for as little as $3 a month, link for that will be down below. Comment down below if you have one of these snakes, or if you're planning on getting one, or maybe if you found this video useful. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you later.